My stepdad said, "Real men don't cry over dead dogs." Then he kicked the urn off the table. He didn't know my biological father was standing in the hallway recording everything. I was 17 when my German Shepherd Max died from cancer, 3 months after my mom married Dennis. Max had been with me since I was 7 years old, through my parents' divorce, through moving 6 times, through every bad day and panic attack and lonely night. He slept at the foot of my bed and knew when I was upset before I did. The vet said the tumors had spread too fast to operate and we had 2 weeks maximum. I spent every minute of those 2 weeks with Max, sleeping on the floor next to him, feeding him by hand when he couldn't stand up anymore. When he died in my arms on a Thursday morning, something inside me broke in a way I'd never experienced before. My mom held me while I sobbed, and we made arrangements to have him cremated. The urn arrived on a Monday, simple black ceramic with Max's name engraved on a small brass plate. I put it on the bookshelf in my room where I could see it from my bed. Dennis had barely tolerated Max while he was alive, complaining about dog hair on the furniture and the cost of vet bills and how my mom babied both of us too much. He'd moved into our house 4 months earlier after a quick engagement that felt rushed to everyone except my mom. She'd been lonely after the divorce, and Dennis had this smooth way of talking that made her feel special and protected. He sold insurance and drove a leased BMW and wore expensive cologne that gave me headaches. Within a week of moving in, he'd started making comments about my room being messy and my grades not being good enough, and how I needed to toughen up if I wanted to survive in the real world. My mom would tell him to back off, that I was going through a hard time, but he'd just smile and say someone needed to teach me how to be a man, since my real father clearly hadn't done the job. The comments got worse after Max died. Dennis would make jokes about how I cried more over a dog than most people cried at human funerals. He'd walk past my room and see me looking at photos of Max on my phone and shake his head like I was pathetic. 3 days after the urn arrived, I came home from school and found Dennis in my room going through my stuff. He said he was looking for something my mom asked him to find, which was obviously a lie. When I asked him to leave, he picked up the urn and examined it like it was a curiosity. He made this comment about how much money people waste on dead pets when they could just throw them in the trash and move on with their lives. I told him to put it down and get out of my room. He just laughed and set the urn back on the shelf, but not gently. He basically dropped it so it landed with a heavy thunk that made me wince. Then he walked past me and said I needed to grow up and stop acting like a little kid mourning a stuffed animal. I texted my biological father that night. My parents had split when I was 13 after my dad came out as gay, and the divorce had been brutal. My mom was angry and hurt and said things to him that she probably regretted later. My dad moved 3 hours away with his partner James, and I only saw him on alternating weekends and some holidays. The distance made it hard to stay close, but we texted almost every day and he always answered when I called. I told him about Dennis going through my room and touching Max's urn and making cruel comments. My dad responded immediately asking if I was okay and whether my mom knew what Dennis was doing. I said I hadn't told her because she seemed happy with Dennis and I didn't want to ruin that for her. My dad wrote back saying that my well-being mattered more than my mom's relationship status, and we should talk more about this when he picked me up that weekend for our visit. That Friday after school, I was in my room doing homework when Dennis came home early from work. I heard him and my mom arguing in the kitchen about money. Something about Dennis losing a big sale and needing to borrow from her savings account to cover his car payment. My mom sounded stressed, but eventually agreed. Their voices got quieter, and I figured the argument was over. About an hour later, Dennis knocked on my door without waiting for an answer and walked in. He was holding a beer, and his face was red in that way that meant he'd probably had several already. He stood in my doorway and started talking about how I needed to show more respect in his house, that he was tired of my attitude and the way I looked at him like he wasn't good enough. I hadn't said anything to him in days, so I had no idea what he was talking about. I stayed quiet and kept working on my homework, hoping he'd just leave. Instead, he walked over to my bookshelf and picked up Max's urn again. He held it up and asked me why I was keeping dead dog ashes in my room like some kind of shrine. He said real men don't cry over dead dogs, and I needed to get over it and move on with my life. Something in his tone made my stomach twist with anger and fear at the same time. I stood up and told him to put the urn down and get out of my room. He laughed this mean drunk laugh and said he was doing me a favor by teaching me a lesson about emotional weakness. Then he held the urn out away from his body and asked what I was going to do about it. I felt my hands shaking and told him again to put it down. He just kept laughing and wobbling slightly like he was considering dropping it. That's when my mom appeared in the doorway asking what was going on. Dennis turned toward her, and the movement made him lose his grip. The urn fell and hit the floor with a horrible cracking sound. The ceramic split into 3 large pieces, and gray ash spilled across my carpet. I dropped to my knees immediately trying to gather the ash with my hands, my vision blurring with tears. My mom was yelling at Dennis, asking what the hell was wrong with him. Dennis was backing away, saying it was an accident and I shouldn't have provoked him. I wasn't listening to either of them. All I could focus on was Max's ashes mixed with carpet fibers, and how I couldn't separate them anymore. I was crying so hard I couldn't breathe, and my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold anything. My mom dropped down next to me and put her arm around my shoulders. She was crying too and apologizing over and over. Dennis stood there for another minute watching us. then said he was going out and left the house. We heard his BMW start up and drive away. We spent the next hour carefully collecting as much ash as we could into a plastic container. My mom vacuumed the carpet after, and I could hear her crying in the bathroom afterward. I sat on my bed holding the plastic container and feeling completely hollow. The urn pieces were on my desk, and one of them still had part of the brass nameplate visible. I took photos of everything: the broken urn, the ash on the carpet before we cleaned it, the plastic container we'd had to use because the urn was destroyed. I sent the photos to my dad without any explanation, and he called me immediately. I answered and just started crying before I could say anything. He stayed on the phone with me for over an hour while I explained everything. He was furious in this quiet, controlled way that was somehow scarier than if he'd been yelling. He asked me to record a video describing what happened in my own words, including Dennis's exact comments about real men not crying over dead dogs. He said to send it to him and not tell anyone else about it yet. I recorded the video sitting on my floor with the broken urn and plastic container visible in frame. I described Dennis going through my room multiple times, his comments about Max, the argument with my mom about money, him coming into my room drunk, picking up the urn and dropping it. I described his exact words about real men and emotional weakness. I sent the video to my dad, and he responded saying he was coming to get me early tomorrow morning instead of waiting until evening. He said he was bringing James, and they'd be there by 9 a.m., and I should pack a bag. That night I barely slept, just lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about Max's ashes in a plastic container instead of the urn we'd chosen carefully. Around 3 a.m. I heard Dennis come home, stumbling up the stairs and going into my mom's room. I heard them arguing in low voices for a while before it got quiet. The next morning my dad showed up at exactly 9 a.m. with James. My mom answered the door looking exhausted, and her eyes were swollen from crying. Dennis appeared behind her in sweatpants and a t-shirt, his hair messy and his face puffy. My dad asked if they could come in to discuss what happened last night. My mom nodded, and they all went into the living room. I stayed in the kitchen doorway watching. My dad's voice was calm and measured when he asked Dennis to explain his version of events. Dennis immediately got defensive and said it was an accident, that I'd provoked him by being disrespectful, and that my mom was overreacting to something that wasn't a big deal. My dad asked Dennis what specific disrespectful behavior I'd shown. Dennis couldn't give any examples beyond saying I had attitude and looked at him wrong. My dad asked Dennis if he thought it was appropriate to enter my room without permission. Dennis said it was his house and he could go anywhere he wanted. That's when my dad pulled out his phone and asked if he could play something for everyone. My mom looked confused and Dennis looked annoyed. My dad played the video I'd sent him the night before, where I described everything in detail, including Dennis's exact words. Watching Dennis's face while he listened to my account was surreal. He got redder and started shaking his head and saying I was exaggerating and taking things out of context. When the video ended, my dad calmly said he had several questions. He asked Dennis if he denied going through my room multiple times. Dennis said he was looking for something my mom asked him to find. My dad asked my mom if she'd ever asked Dennis to go through my room. My mom said no, she hadn't. Dennis's face got even redder. My dad asked Dennis if he denied making comments about real men not crying over dead dogs. Dennis said I was being too sensitive and needed to toughen up. My dad asked Dennis if he was drunk when he came into my room last night. Dennis said he'd had a couple beers after a stressful day at work. My dad put his phone away and said he'd heard enough. He looked at my mom and said he was taking me home with him for the weekend as planned, but he wanted to discuss custody arrangements because this living situation was clearly unsafe for me. My mom's face crumpled, and she started crying. Dennis exploded and said my dad had no right to come into his house and make threats. My dad's voice stayed perfectly calm when he said he wasn't making threats. He was stating facts. He said Dennis had destroyed property that belonged to me, made emotionally abusive comments over several weeks, and entered my private space repeatedly without permission. He said if my mom wanted to stay married to Dennis, that was her choice, but I would not be living in the same house as him anymore. Dennis stood up and got in my dad's face, saying he couldn't just take me away whenever he felt like it. James stepped between them and told Dennis to back up. Dennis shoved James, and that's when everything happened fast. My dad pulled out his phone again and said he'd been recording this entire conversation with everyone's knowledge based on announcing it when he asked to play the first video. He said he now had Dennis on video shoving James, which was assault. He said he also had documentation of Dennis's pattern of behavior toward me, including the destroyed urn and emotional abuse. He said he would be filing for emergency custody modification on Monday morning and would be providing all this evidence to the family court judge. Dennis's face went from red to pale in seconds. He looked at my mom and said she needed to make my dad leave or he was calling the police. My mom looked at Dennis like she was seeing him for the first time and told him very quietly to get out of her house. Dennis stared at her in shock. She repeated herself louder, telling him to pack his things and leave. He started arguing and saying she was being manipulated by my dad. She cut him off and said she'd just watched video evidence of her husband destroying her son's property and emotionally abusing him, and she wanted Dennis out of her house immediately. Dennis stormed upstairs, and we could hear him throwing things around in the bedroom. My mom sat down on the couch and put her face in her hands. My dad sat next to her and said he wasn't trying to take me away from her, but I needed to feel safe at home. He said she was a good mom who'd made a mistake trusting the wrong person. She sobbed and said she was so sorry, that she'd been lonely, and Dennis had seemed so stable and responsible at first. My dad put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Predatory people are often very good at seeming stable until they're not." James stayed near the stairs in case Dennis tried something. After about 20 minutes, Dennis came down with 2 suitcases and a duffel bag. He didn't look at any of us, just walked to the door. Before he left, he turned around and pointed at me and said this was all my fault for being a spoiled little brat who couldn't handle tough love. My dad stood up and stepped in front of me. He told Dennis to leave immediately or he'd call the police and show them the video of Dennis shoving James. Dennis left, slamming the door behind him. The house felt different with Dennis gone. Lighter somehow, despite everyone crying. My mom asked me to forgive her, and I told her I wasn't mad at her, just hurt that she hadn't noticed what Dennis was doing. She cried harder and said she'd been so focused on having a partner again that she hadn't paid attention to how he treated me. My dad suggested we all sit down and figure out the practical next steps. He said he'd still take me for the weekend so my mom could process everything, but he wanted her to file for a restraining order against Dennis on Monday morning. He said the video evidence made it clear Dennis had been emotionally abusive, and the physical altercation with James gave grounds for protection. My mom agreed and said she'd also be calling a divorce lawyer first thing Monday. I went upstairs to pack my bag and my mom followed me. She stood in my doorway and looked at the broken urn pieces still on my desk. She asked if there was any way to fix it, or if we needed to find a new urn. I said I didn't know if ceramic could be glued back together properly, and even if it could, it wouldn't feel the same knowing Dennis had broken it. She nodded and said we'd find a better one together, something Dennis had never touched. She hugged me for a long time and whispered that she loved me, and she was so sorry. I hugged her back and told her I loved her too. Then I packed enough clothes for a few days and grabbed the plastic container with Max's ashes and the broken urn pieces because I didn't want to leave them in the house. The drive to my dad's place was quiet. James drove while my dad sat in back with me. About halfway there, my dad said he'd been documenting Dennis's behavior for weeks, based on what I'd been telling him in texts. He said he'd consulted with his lawyer friend before coming over this morning and had been prepared to file for emergency custody modification regardless of what happened. He said the destruction of Max's urn was the breaking point that made him act immediately, instead of waiting to gather more evidence. He asked me how I was feeling, and I said I didn't know yet, that everything felt surreal. He said that was normal, and I'd probably have complicated emotions for a while. When we got to their house, James made lunch while my dad helped me settle into the guest room. That night, we watched movies and didn't talk about anything serious. I slept better than I had in weeks. On Monday morning, my mom called and said she'd filed for a restraining order against Dennis, and the judge granted a temporary order based on the video evidence. She said Dennis had to stay at least 500 feet away from her, me, and the house. She'd also retained a divorce lawyer who said the case would be straightforward since they'd only been married 4 months and had a prenuptial agreement. My dad's lawyer filed the emergency custody modification request that same day, citing the unsafe living environment and Dennis's abusive behavior. The family court scheduled a hearing for the following week. In the meantime, my dad said I could stay with him and James and we'd figure out school logistics. My mom drove up that evening with more of my clothes and some of my stuff from my room, including my computer and books. She looked better than she had on Saturday, more focused and less shaky. She said she'd been going through Dennis's things that he left behind and found some disturbing stuff. She showed us a notebook Dennis had been keeping with notes about me. The entries described different ways he'd tried to provoke me or get a reaction, almost like he was running experiments. He'd written things like subject shows weakness when discussing dead pet, and subject has no spine when confronted about room cleanliness. The entries went back to about a week after he moved in. My dad photographed every page with his phone while my mom sat there looking sick. She said she found other stuff too, like emails to his ex-wife where Dennis admitted to deliberately antagonizing her teenage son until the kid became so anxious he had to go to therapy. The emails talked about how emotional weakness disgusted Dennis, and he felt it was his duty to toughen up soft kids. My dad immediately sent these to his lawyer as additional evidence. He said it showed a clear pattern of targeting stepchildren for emotional abuse, which would support the emergency custody modification. The restraining order hearing happened 3 days later. Dennis showed up with a lawyer and tried to argue that my mom was overreacting and being manipulated by my dad. His lawyer played up the angle that Dennis had made a mistake while drinking but didn't deserve to be kicked out of his own home. The judge watched the video evidence and looked through the notebook entries. Then she asked Dennis directly if he'd been keeping notes documenting ways to provoke his teenage stepson. Dennis tried to claim the notebook was therapy homework his counselor assigned. The judge asked for the counselor's contact information to verify. Dennis couldn't provide it because obviously he'd made it up. The judge extended the restraining order for 6 months and said Dennis was prohibited from any contact with my mom or me. She said the notebook evidence suggested premeditated emotional abuse rather than isolated incidents of poor judgment. My mom's divorce lawyer moved fast after that. She filed for annulment based on fraud, arguing that Dennis had deliberately hidden his history of abusing stepchildren and his real financial situation. Discovery revealed Dennis was actually deeply in debt and had been counting on access to my mom's savings and home equity. His salary was largely commission-based, and he'd been having a terrible year, but hid it by leasing luxury items he couldn't afford. The annulment went through in 6 weeks, which my mom's lawyer said was unusually fast, but the evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the family court custody modification was also approved. The judge said given Dennis's documented pattern of emotional abuse and the unsafe environment he created, I would live primarily with my dad until I turned 18 in 8 months. My mom could visit anytime, and I could stay at her house on weekends if I wanted to. The judge commended my dad for documenting everything properly and taking appropriate action to protect me. 3 weeks after everything blew up, my mom and I went shopping for a new urn for Max's ashes. We found a beautiful wooden one made from cherry wood with brass corners and a brass plate where we could have Max's name engraved again. The funeral home we'd originally used offered to transfer the ashes for us, since the cremains were in a plastic container. When we picked up the finished urn a week later, my mom cried seeing Max's name engraved on it. She said she was sorry it took Dennis destroying the first one for her to realize how wrong her marriage had been. I told her I didn't blame her for what Dennis did, that manipulative people are good at hiding who they really are. She asked if I'd be willing to go to family counseling with her, and I said yes. Our first counseling session was awkward. The therapist, Dr. Patel, asked us each to describe what happened from our perspectives. My mom talked about being lonely after the divorce and feeling like she needed a partner to be complete. She said Dennis had seemed confident and stable, and she'd ignored red flags because she wanted to believe she'd found someone good. I talked about Dennis's comments and behaviors escalating over time, about feeling like I couldn't tell my mom because she seemed happy, about the relief I felt when my dad stepped in and documented everything. Dr. Patel said it was common for abusive people to isolate their targets by creating situations where victims feel they can't speak up. She said my mom would need to work on recognizing those patterns so she didn't repeat them in future relationships. She said I would need to work on trusting that it was safe to speak up when something felt wrong. Dennis violated the restraining order about 2 months after it was issued. He drove past my mom's house slowly multiple times one evening, and a neighbor called the police after recognizing his car. The cops pulled him over 3 blocks away and arrested him. His lawyer tried to argue he was just driving through the neighborhood for legitimate reasons, but the neighbor's statement and the fact that Dennis had circled the block 4 times made that defense weak. The judge extended the restraining order to 2 years and gave Dennis 30 days in jail for the violation. My mom called me after the hearing and said she finally felt like she could breathe knowing Dennis faced real consequences. I kept seeing Dr. Patel individually to work through everything. She helped me understand that Dennis's behavior wasn't about me being weak or needing to toughen up. She explained that people who target others for emotional abuse are usually dealing with their own insecurity and sense of inadequacy. She said Dennis had likely felt threatened by my close relationship with my mom and targeted me to establish dominance in the household. She said the fact that he kept a notebook documenting his efforts to provoke me showed how calculated and deliberate his abuse was. That helped me stop questioning whether I'd actually done something wrong to deserve his treatment. We also worked on processing my grief about Max, separate from the trauma of Dennis destroying the urn. She said the 2 events had become tangled together in my mind, and I needed to be able to mourn Max without always associating it with Dennis's cruelty. My mom started dating again about 6 months after the annulment, but this time she moved much more carefully. She joined a support group for people recovering from abusive relationships and worked with her own therapist. She introduced me to her new boyfriend, Mark, after they'd been dating for 3 months, and she was very clear with him about boundaries and expectations. Mark was gentle and respectful, and never tried to act like a father figure. He asked me about Max when he noticed the urn on the shelf in my room at my mom's house, and I told him the whole story, including Dennis destroying the first urn. Mark listened and said he was sorry that happened, and that Max sounded like he'd been a great dog. He didn't try to offer advice or tell me how I should feel, just acknowledged it and moved on. That meant more to me than he probably realized. I graduated high school 8 months after everything with Dennis happened. My mom and dad both came to the ceremony along with James and Mark. They all sat together and were civil to each other, which felt like a small miracle given how bitter the divorce had been years earlier. At the graduation party my mom hosted afterward, my dad pulled me aside and said he was proud of how I'd handled everything. He said a lot of kids in my situation would have become bitter or angry, but I'd managed to process the trauma in a healthy way with therapy and support. He said he was sorry he'd had to step in so dramatically, but he'd do it again without hesitation. I told him I was grateful he'd been there and had known what to do. He said that's what parents are for, protecting their kids even when the threat comes from within the family. About a year after Dennis went to jail for violating the restraining order, my mom got a letter from his new girlfriend warning her about his behavior. The girlfriend had found our court records online while searching Dennis's name after he started making controlling comments to her. She said Dennis had told her his ex-wife was crazy and vindictive, but after reading the evidence, she realized he was the problem. She thanked my mom for documenting everything publicly because it saved her from making the same mistake. My mom forwarded the letter to me and said she hoped Dennis would eventually get real help, but she wasn't holding her breath. She said people like Dennis rarely change because they don't think they've done anything wrong. I started college that fall at a university near my dad's house. I'd considered schools closer to my mom, but ultimately decided I wanted to be near my dad and James, since I'd spent the last year living with them and felt settled. My mom understood and said she'd visit whenever I wanted her to. I'd gotten into therapy at the University Counseling Center and was still processing everything that happened. My therapist said trauma has a way of resurfacing when you finally feel safe, and that's what was happening now that I wasn't in survival mode anymore. I'd have random panic attacks triggered by things that reminded me of Dennis, like the smell of the cologne he wore or the sound of someone slamming doors. But I was learning to manage them better and not feel ashamed when they happened. The restraining order against Dennis expired after 2 years. My mom's lawyer said she could request an extension, but my mom decided not to, unless Dennis tried to contact her again. She said she didn't want to give him any more power over her life by staying legally connected. I was 19 by then and not living at home anymore, so I felt less vulnerable to whatever Dennis might do. My mom changed her phone number and blocked Dennis on all social media just to be safe. As far as we knew, Dennis had moved to a different state and wasn't in contact with anyone we knew. His ex-wife told my mom through mutual friends that Dennis had done the same thing to her that he'd done to us, targeting her son and keeping notes about ways to provoke the kid. She said she wished she'd documented it as thoroughly as we had so she could have warned future partners more effectively. The cherry wood urn with Max's ashes still sits on my shelf in my apartment. I'm in my early 20s now and Max has been gone for years, but I still think about him and miss him. The urn itself has become important beyond just holding his ashes because it represents the moment my dad stepped in and protected me, the moment my mom chose me over a toxic relationship, and the moment I learned that documenting abuse gives you power when people try to gaslight you. Whenever I have a hard day, I look at that urn and remember that I survived something genuinely terrible and came out stronger. Dr. Patel says that's called post-traumatic growth, and it doesn't mean the trauma was worth it, just that I managed to build something meaningful from the wreckage. My relationship with my mom is better now than it's been since before her marriage to Dennis. She's still with Mark, and they seem genuinely happy together in a healthy way. My dad and James are still together too, and I'm grateful every day that my dad was willing to step in and fight for me, even when it meant conflict with my mom. The whole experience taught me that family is complicated, and imperfect people can still show up when it matters. My mom made a mistake trusting Dennis, but she believed me and took action once she understood what was happening. My dad had been paying attention to what I wasn't saying in my texts and knew when to intervene. That combination of awareness and willingness to act is what protected me from Dennis's escalating abuse. I think about Dennis sometimes and wonder if he's doing the same thing to another family. Part of me feels guilty that I didn't do more to warn people, but my therapist reminds me that I was a teenager dealing with trauma, and it wasn't my responsibility to protect the world from my stepdad. She says the court records are public and anyone who searches Dennis's name will find them, which is more than most abuse victims are able to create. The notebook evidence was particularly damning because it showed premeditation and pattern, which helped other people recognize Dennis's behavior when he tried it again. My mom's decision to document everything, and my dad's insistence on recording conversations gave us leverage when the legal system could have easily dismissed our claims as family drama. The whole situation with Dennis taught me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even when authority figures or family members insist I'm overreacting. I learned that documentation is power, and that people who have nothing to hide don't usually react with rage when asked to explain their behavior. I learned that real strength isn't about refusing to cry or show emotion. It's about being vulnerable enough to ask for help when you need it. Dennis thought he was teaching me to be a man by mocking my grief and destroying something I loved. What he actually taught me was to recognize abuse and stand up against it, which turned out to be much more valuable. And that's the end of the story. I'm so glad you joined me because it makes telling these feel meaningful. Hopefully, it brought some light to your day. Subscribe so we can do it again.